Well, to further examine Egypt's turbulent 3 years, I'm joined in the studio by Abdullah Al-Arian. He's an assistant professor of history at Georgetown University. Thanks very much for being with us, Abdullah. So when you look at the reasons 3 years ago why people came out to the streets in Egypt and what eventually led to the downfall of Hosni Mubarak, do these reasons still exist today?
Well, certainly all of the same complaints. In fact, we've seen actually that they've been escalated. All of the kind of socio-economic difficulties that people have had, the repression of political rights, have only increased in the last 7 or 8 months since the coup took place. And so we've seen, of course, massive widespread demonstrations due to this repression. We've seen, of course, killings and unprecedented violence in Egypt's modern history, imprisonments, and, of course, a lack of expression, lack of free expression for any Egyptian who's opposing anything that the military is currently trying to do. And so, of course, in many ways, we can see that this revolution hasn't actually accomplished any of its stated goals.
I want to pick you up on that point that you mentioned, the socio-economic reasons, because over the past 3 years, the economy certainly has deteriorated and suffered. I can say that, right? I'm looking at a statement here from the anti-coup alliance, and they've released a statement on February the 11th calling for huge demonstrations across Egypt on Tuesday. I mean, do you get the sense that people kind of want to get on with their lives and get the economy back on track again? Or do these demonstrations still have the support, the will, as well as the ability do these people have the ability to come out onto the streets en masse?
There are two things that are going on. On the one hand, of course, the military, since the coup, has basically tried to sell the Egyptian people a platform of stability, of economic upturn, given the kinds of difficulties that people have faced over the last 3 years. And of course, they've asked people to sacrifice their political freedoms in exchange for security and stability and economic recovery. On the other hand, of course, the military has actually failed to stabilize the situation in Egypt. And as long as they've continued to kind of repress a very significant portion of the population and try to kind of create a new political reality that takes it back to the repressive and authoritarian climate of the Mubarak dictatorship, then of course it's going to continue to face that kind of opposition. And we don't know exactly what the numbers are, but we know that they've certainly only increased and that this extends beyond just the Muslim Brotherhood at this point, which of course has originally was the organization leading that opposition. But with that group now defunct, with it no longer any kind of centralized leadership, given that they're all imprisoned, we've seen that these protests have become far more organic and decentralized. And the government, of course, has failed to really stabilize the situation, the security situation within Egypt. And we've seen, of course, an outbreak of violence in addition to the massive sit-ins and demonstrations that have been largely peaceful.
Is there a comparison to be made at all between Tunisia, for example, and Yemen and Egypt? In Tunisia, we saw a constitution now come into effect, an all-inclusive constitution, I should say. In Yemen, there was the Gulf Initiative, also for reconciliation in the country. I mean, do you see Egypt heading towards some type of reconciliation anytime soon? We're expecting presidential as well as parliamentary elections later this year. Is it a climate that is conducive to holding these elections?
Not at all. I think the problem is that once Mubarak was removed, it was a sort of aborted revolution because there were no real reforms to the security sector, to the military, to the judiciary. And so all of these pre-existing state institutions have continued kind of as business as usual and have tried to kind of reassert their control and reassert their authority. I think the success in some of these other cases was in trying to sideline some of those institutions or at least rein in some of their power, such as the military in Tunisia, which was not charged with overseeing the transition the same way the Egyptian army stepped in and decided that it was going to try to oversee the transition to something new. And of course, once the Muslim Brotherhood was elected and once the revolutionaries kind of in the street were sidelined from that process and were forced essentially to defer to the military's authority, the recipe was ripe really there for a return back to the status quo, and I think that's what we've seen so far. And in these conditions, I don't think we can judge whether a constitutional referendum or presidential or parliamentary elections in the same way that we were looking at elections 2 years ago. Now I think the conditions are far worse and much more likely to be more of just a formality to bring in this authoritarian government.
Okay, Abdullah, thank you. Abdullah Al-Arian from Georgetown University.